Chapter 051. Out of Control. The new restart began in the same manner as all of his previous restarts, with Kiriel mercilessly jumping on top of him to wake him up. "Good morning, brother." Kiriel yelled on top of him. "Morning, Hey." With a simple act of will, Zorian seized Kiriel telekinetically and levitated her into the air. She stopped her customary morning greeting with a startled yelp, her hands grasping around her in a panicky attempt to find some sort of purchase and stop her ascent. She struggled in vain. Perhaps if she had been expecting Zorian to levitate her off of him, she could have grabbed onto something in time, but she had been caught completely by surprise and was entirely at his mercy. After a few moments of wild flailing, she seemed to realize this and pouted at him. "That's not fair," she complained, looking down on him from her vantage point above him. "Since when can you even do that?" Zorian ignored the question, instead studying the magic he was using to levitate her with his mana perception. He was still a long way from mastering even the most basic forms of mana perception, but an entire month of Svim's tutelage was definitely showing its results. Even a rudimentary ability to sense his own mana flow helped immensely when performing unstructured magic like he was currently doing, allowing him to notice and correct minute flaws in his technique that would have otherwise destabilized the whole undertaking. It was somewhat embarrassing that he had neglected such a potent skill all this time, but maybe it was fortunate he had done so. It was Svim's guidance as much as the shaping exercises themselves that was responsible for his rapid growth in the skill, and he would have wasted a huge amount of time if he had tried to piece things together on his own. Taking advantage of his momentary distraction, Kiriel suddenly started struggling again, swiping at him with her hands in an attempt to reel herself back down. Zorian promptly floated her further up in the air, causing her to miss his covers by a few hairs. "Oh, come on," she whined. "Zorian, don't be such a jerk. Put me down." Zorian gave her an evil smile and started to float her sideways, away from the bed. "Slowly," Kiriel quickly clarified, catching on to what he intended to do. "Put me down slowly." He thought about letting her fall and then telekinetically catching her in the last moment before she hit the floor, but quickly discarded the idea. He wasn't that confident in his unstructured levitation skills, or his timing for that matter. He gently floated Kiriel down to the floor and got out of bed. Unfortunately, Kiriel was rather fascinated by her brief experience with magical levitation, and was instantly upon him, bombarding him with an endless stream of questions. Well, that kind of backfired on him. He just couldn't get her to calm down. "How long can you keep doing that?" Kiriel asked. "I don't know," Zorian said. And he really didn't, but he was hoping that if he answered some of her more inconsequential questions, she would eventually give the matter a rest. As such, he tried to give her a more detailed answer. "It would depend heavily on how docile you were being and whether I had something else disrupting my concentration. At least an hour, assuming I had your cooperation." "Great," Kiriel said happily. "In that case, I have an idea." Zorian slowly descended down the stairs, trying not to make too much noise. The idea, after all, was to surprise Mother, and he couldn't exactly do that if... "Zorian, get down here already," his mother shouted, the sound of her footsteps making it clear she was rapidly approaching the bottom of the stairs. "Your breakfast is getting... cold." She entered the main hallway where the stairway was located and then stopped to stare at the spectacle. Zorian himself was fairly unremarkable, but Kiriel was floating in the air beside him instead of using the stairs. There was a brief moment of silence as the two sides stared at each other, one in surprise and the other in expectation of an eventual reaction. In the end, though, it was Kiriel who eventually broke the standoff. The little imp just didn't have the patience to stick to the plan. "Mom, I'm flying," Kiriel announced loudly, waving her hands up and down in mimicry of flapping wings. Mother opened her mouth for a second to say something but then thought better of it. She silently rolled her eyes and turned her back on them, mumbling something uncharitable about mages and children. "When you're done playing around, come and eat," she told Zorian before disappearing into the kitchen again. Zorian and Kiriel shared a glance. Conveniently enough, with Kiriel floating beside him as she was, they were actually at the same eye level. "It was totally worth it," Kiriel opined. Yeah, it was. Thus it so happened that Sumrak's quest for restoring his lost memories took him to Corsa, where he descended into the tunnels beneath the city in search of the mythical scorpion swordsman, and the even more mythical orb of memory which they guarded, Zorian spoke dramatically. Little did he know, however, that the Scorpion swordsmen were not nearly as honorable as the myths had made them out to be, and that his journey into the depths beneath Corsa would be his most dangerous adventure yet. Zorian swept his hand through the air with a flourish, and the illusion that was there promptly dissolved into ectoplasmic smoke, only to reform into a completely different illusionary scene. Kiriel sat on the edge of her seat, listening in rapt attention. Over the various restarts, Zorian had more or less worked out what sort of things Kiriel found impressive and interesting, so it wasn't very difficult to keep her attention these days. Which was good because it made the long train ride at the start of the restart a lot more bearable for both of them than it would have otherwise been. Only half of his attention was on the story he was telling, though. He was also considering what to do in this new restart. More specifically, he was considering whether to have another relatively quiet restart like the previous one had been, or if he should notify the Triumvirate Church about Sudamir's soul trap. The first option seemed more sensible. He had only 2 more restarts, including this one, to raise his skill at interpreting Iranian memories to levels necessary to open the Matriarch's memory packet, and he couldn't afford to get distracted too much. Aside from that, the second option was very attention-grabbing and had the potential of leading Red Robe straight towards him if he did it even slightly wrong. The choice seemed obvious, but Zorian was getting concerned. Red Robe was being too quiet. Sure, the third time traveler may be laboring under the delusion that there's a whole army of other time travelers out to get him, but Zorian would have still expected Red Robe to make some kind of move by now, even if strictly through proxies. That Zorian could detect no trace of Red Robe's actions was slowly making him more and more paranoid. It didn't help his peace of mind that both Taven and Kale were even more certain than Zorian that Red Robe was planning something big rather than simply laying low. Stirring the hornet's nest a little by exposing Sudamir to the authorities just might create enough waves to reveal what Red Robe was planning. In addition to that, pointing the authorities towards Sudamir was bound to do wonders for his investigation into the invasion and their leadership. There was no way that an investigation into Sudamir would not point them towards the cult of the World Dragon and the Abasins. That was almost certainly going to save Zorian months of work, if only because he could watch carefully who they'd arrest and then investigate those people on his own in future restarts. And if he could actually gain access to written records and the investigators' memories? Absolutely priceless. His main problem with trying to map out the organization of the invasion was that he was just one person and had to conduct his investigation under utmost secrecy. An official investigation would not labor under similar limitations. In fact, Zorian suspected that no matter how skilled and experienced he became over the restarts, he would never really be able to match the investigative power of the entirety of Eldamar and its counterintelligence agencies. People who worked there had dedicated their whole lives to this sort of thing, and he knew for a fact that Eldamar had mind mages of their own under their employ. They could discover things that Zorian wouldn't even think of looking for, because he didn't possess the necessary background to know which questions to ask. The more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. He would have to be very, very careful, but this could be just what he needed to connect everything together. Yes, he was definitely approaching the church when they arrived in Cyoria. Hey, don't space out now, Kiriel protested. You haven't finished the story. We just got to the good part. Sorry. Zorian apologized hurriedly. He found it kind of amusing that what Kiriel considered good parts usually involved fighting of some sort. Well, that or usage of some kind of epic magic. As I was saying, the Scorpion swordsman had just led Sumrak to the supposed secret area where the orb of memory rested on a pedestal, beneath the holy stalactite, when suddenly his guides turned on him. Though Zorian had resolved to approach the Triumvirate Church about Sudamir, his first action upon settling a little in Cyoria was not to go to the nearest temple. It was to track down Svim and tell him about the time loop. He saw no point in wasting time by waiting until Friday to confront him, as the sooner Zorian told him about the time loop, the sooner Svim would accept it as true and start working with him again. In fact, Zorian had hoped that Svim would be even easier to convince this time, since he was in possession of the password thingy that Svim had given him in the previous restart. Unfortunately, easier didn't mean effortless. Despite the password that Zorian was certain he had memorized correctly, Svim was highly suspicious of him. It took several hours' worth of questions before he was willing to accept Zorian's story even provisionally, and he didn't seem terribly convinced even then. He told Zorian they would talk more on Friday and then basically kicked him out of his house. Maybe he should have waited until Monday and spoken to Svim in his office instead of visiting him at his home. No matter. Depending on how things went with the church, he might actually need a free week to set things up properly. The next day he went to a temple. Specifically, he went to a temple he had already visited in the previous restarts. The one with the nice green-haired priest and the future divining high priestess. There was no particular reason to pick that temple over the others other than familiarity, but he didn't think it would matter. Whatever temple he went to, they would still report to the same parent organization. Batak was as polite and welcoming as always. He immediately greeted Zorian upon his arrival at the temple and ushered him inside. After serving them both some tea and engaging in some small talk, he probed Zorian for his reason of coming. "It's unusual to see a young man like you visit our temple," Batak remarked. "Do you do this often?" "Well, no," Zorian admitted. "To be honest, I tend to avoid temples. I've had some bad experiences with them in the past. But I wanted to report something and ask for some advice, so here I am." "Oh. What kind of bad experiences?" Batak asked curiously. Of course he wanted to know about that. Zorian would have thought that something to report would have aroused Batak's curiosity more, but apparently not. "It's a bit of a long story," Zorian sighed. "The first thing you have to keep in mind is that I am an empath." "As in, you can sense other people's emotions?" asked Batak. "A useful gift. When trained," Zorian nodded. "But as a child I had no control over it. I didn't even know I'm an empath. All I knew was that being around large groups of people made me sick and dizzy. And back in my hometown of Siren, the temple was usually packed full of people. The few times my parents brought me there, I ended up fainting and causing a bit of a stir." "That's unfortunate," Batak said sympathetically. "Not as unfortunate as the old priest's reaction was," Zorian said, shaking his head. "He really took my reaction personally. He decided that I have some kind of bad blood that was repelled by the holiness of the temple." "Bad blood?" Batak asked incredulously. "My mother was of which lineage?" Zorian clarified. "Ah," Batak said in understanding. "That makes more sense. While I don't condone the man's reaction, it was not entirely unreasonable to believe you have some witch-descended bloodline issue going on with you. Lineages were very important to witches, and they loved inheritable magic abilities. Many of their influential families had some kind of bloodline power to draw on." "Wait," Zorian frowned. "Then my empathy." "It is entirely possible," Batak nodded. "Damn. So it was possible that the bigoted old priest could have actually been right about him, at least in a way? Because if his empathy really was something he had inherited through his witch lineage, then bad blood really did have a hand in his fainting episodes. He didn't know whether to be amused or bitter about that. "I thought empathy was fairly generic as far as special powers go," Zorian said. "Lots of people have it, relatively speaking. Special powers don't pop out of nowhere," Batak said. "Most are a product of potions, rituals, spiritual possession and the like. But sometimes these powers can get transferred to a person's descendants while staying dormant for a generation or two before resurfacing. It's a bit of a public secret, but when a child is born with a magic power out of nowhere, that almost always means the child has some interesting things hidden in their family tree. In regards to empathy being relatively common, well, I'm guessing that there are more people with, shall we say, interesting backgrounds than most people would be willing to admit. That was very interesting because witches were endemic to Altazia, but empaths could be found all over the 3 continents inhabited by humans. Zorian didn't think all those empaths in Mycena and Sand drew their roots from some witch born in Altazia. Assuming that Batak was indeed right and random empaths originated from an ancestor that deliberately made themselves psychic, that would mean that lots of people managed to turn themselves psychic over the course of history. In other words, there was some kind of reliable method of turning normal people into psychics circulating around. It couldn't be too easy since empaths were still rather rare, but clearly it wasn't impossibly hard either. There was also the matter of his family. If his psychic nature was indeed some kind of pseudo-bloodline thing, then his mother and siblings were bound to have it as well, if only in a dormant fashion. He knew that most of them were not full-blown psychics since he would have felt it if they were, but maybe Daimen was. His oldest brother did have an uncanny ability to understand people. Well, there was no way to confirm it one way or the other. Daimen was in Koth, and Zorian didn't think he could reach him even if he dedicated an entire restart just to get there. Unless he found a way to instantly reach another continent or something, they would never meet while the time loop lasted. In any case, even if the rest of his family weren't fully psychic, there may yet be a way to awaken their dormant mind magic talent. It was surely easier to unlock a dormant magic ability than to create it out of nowhere, so he couldn't help but wonder if it was possible to, say, make Kiriel psychic in a relatively easy and painless fashion. Not that he would do that, as the idea of a psychic Kiriel absolutely terrified him, but maybe once she was older and able to handle the power responsibly. Anyway, Batak continued after a short pause, I believe you said something about wanting to make a report and needing advice? Yes, Zorian said. He then withdrew a blank, sealed envelope from his pocket and handed it to Batak, who frowned at him. An anonymous report? Batak mumbled to himself. Personally, Zorian didn't feel this was very anonymous. Anonymous would have meant sending the letter through normal mail without ever having to meet face-to-face with anyone. Unfortunately, as much as Zorian liked that idea, that would have gotten him nowhere. Such a report would not be taken seriously at all, and would likely be thrown into the trash before it ever reached someone important. If he wanted the church to actually do something, he had to talk to an actual priest and have them vouch from him that his report had been made in good faith. I have to ask, is this absolutely necessary? Batak said, concerned. The information contained in the letter concerns the crimes of a highly influential person with plenty of subordinates, Zorian said blandly. If my name is known, I would fear for my safety. I see, Batak sighed. Very well, I will forward your report to my superiors as it is. I must warn you, however, that they are not terribly fond of anonymous reports. They are seen as unreliable. Rest assured that your concerns will be looked into, but it may take some time before the church investigators get around to it. How long is some time? Zorian frowned. A few weeks. Possibly months if something more urgent comes up, Batak said. Damn. So much for that idea. It seemed he would have to go with his plan B, talking to Olenek Zosk. He had wanted to avoid doing that since he kind of doubted that the old warrior priest would just leave him be without any questions afterwards, but it seemed he had no choice. If he absolutely had to make a face-to-face report to someone, Olenek was probably his best shot. The man was almost certain to believe him and probably cared enough about Zorian to keep his identity secret. He could always just end the restart prematurely if things got too out of hand. Well, with that out of the way, what can I advise you about? Batak asked, pushing the letter to the side of the table. Souls and necromancy, Zorian told him bluntly. Oh, Batak said, suddenly sitting a little straighter. That is quite an unusual topic to ask about. Young man, the only advice about necromancy I can give you is, don't use it. I wasn't planning to, Zorian shook his head. What I want to know is why somebody else might do so. And also why they would feel the need to gather thousands of souls and keep them imprisoned in a giant crystal pillar. Batak gave him a blank look, glanced to the side of the table where Zorian's sealed letter was innocently resting, then gave Zorian another blank look. Then he placed the letter in front of him again and wrote urgent on top of the envelope in big blocky letters before setting it aside again. Well, Zorian still intended to go talk to Olenek, since he had no idea how much influence Batak's little remark would have on his superiors, but he was still touched by the gesture. You probably know this, but souls are very mysterious things, Batak said seriously. They have many functions, most of which we can't even understand, much less influence. But their most important function is not, as many mages believe, that they allow one to produce and shape mana. It is the fact they serve as a living, breathing record of everything a particular entity is. Zorian raised his eyebrows in incomprehension. The gods originally gave souls to living beings in order to record their thoughts and forms, so that their lives may be preserved after death and their deeds properly judged in the afterlife, Batak said. For that reason, the gods, who had intimate knowledge of how souls worked, were capable of many miraculous things. So long as they had access to a person's soul, they could bring them back to life, even if their bodies had been reduced to ash and scattered into the winds. They could peer into their soul to examine their entire life from the moment they were born. They could restore a person's youth by regressing their forms to the state they once possessed. According to some stories, they could even create an identical copy of a person, indistinguishable from the original in every way. Copies of people? Zorian frowned. It is not that strange, Batak said, waving his hand dismissively. The simulacrum spell does something very similar. While simulacrums are in no way flawless, they are sufficiently real that some people have argued the use of the spell is inherently unethical. They believe that every time a simulacrum disperses, a person dies. Do you? Zorian asked. No, Batak shook his head. Naturally, I follow my church's dogma, and it states that only things with souls are considered people. Simulacrums do not have them. But this is a digression, and I am not an expert on such magic. What is important is that soul magic has the potential of giving earthly mages godlike powers over their fellow man. It is little wonder then that many people have coveted such power over the years. Their efforts have been mostly in vain, but that doesn't stop necromancers from committing atrocity after atrocity in an effort to unlock mysteries of the soul. Zorian considered this information for a few moments. The idea of souls as divine recording devices was totally plausible to him, since he could clearly see that simply sending his soul back in time could keep his memories intact. Which was rather curious now that he thought about it. It was common knowledge that human minds were stored inside the brain. Was his soul overwriting his brain cells upon the start of every restart, or was something yet more exotic going on there? Though there was something about that story about gods making copies of people that was nagging him in the back of his head. He felt like he was missing something important. So why is soul damage so catastrophic to the body? Zorian asked curiously. Clearly the connection between the body and soul is not just one way. Clearly, Batak agreed. But nobody really understands the nature of that connection and the way it works. It is known that souls cannot think or feel when not embodied in something. The soul needs a body even if it's just an ectoplasmic shell. But the body equally needs a soul. It's likely that such a catastrophic reaction to soul damage has a lot to do with a person's life force, however. Zorian racked his brains for a moment, trying to remember what life force had to do with anything. If he remembered correctly, life force was simply a special type of personal mana that wasn't part of a mage's mana pool and was used exclusively by the body to keep itself living and resist foreign magics. Since the amount of life force rarely varied much between humans, and couldn't be used to power spells, the academy instructors hadn't spoken much about it. Wait, that was it, wasn't it? Life force was something every living being had and depended on to stay alive. And it was basically just an exotic form of mana. And the outer portion of the soul, the part that can get warped and mutilated, was the one in charge of regulating a person's mana flow. If a person's soul was damaged, that would cause their very life-giving energies to spin out of control. I understand now, Zorian nodded. Though if I could trouble you for a few more questions. 2 hours later, Zorian wrapped up his conversation with Batak and left the temple. Strangely, the green-haired priest actually expressed a wish for Zorian to drop by some time for another chat. Strange. Zorian would have expected the man to be rather leery of him after discussing such a topic. He gave Batak a non-committal response, unsure whether he should take the man's offer, and left for home. The next day, Zorian went to Nyazovdvary to talk to Olenik. Since he had saved Lukav from Sidomir's schemes and helped Olenik drive off his own attackers, he figured that the man would be well disposed towards him and inclined to listen to what he had to say. Just to be sure, however, Zorian had made a little detour before talking to the warrior priest. He went to the house of Vazin, the merchant that did Sidomir's dirty work, and stole all the incriminating evidence from his safe. In the end, though, Olenik didn't even look at all those papers Zorian had brought him. The moment Zorian started talking to him about a mansion full of undead and the soul traps surrounding it, he demanded that Zorian teleport him to the place immediately. Not tomorrow or in an hour or when he was done looking through all the gathered evidence. Immediately. So Zorian did just that, internally grumbling about all the effort he had wasted into preparing his case. Wasn't Olenik in the least bit afraid that Zorian would teleport him into some sort of prearranged trap? No, apparently he wasn't. Once Zorian teleported them to the edge of Ayaska Mansion's ward, Olenik just stood still and stared in the direction of Ayaska Mansion in total silence. This continued for quite a long time. Are you okay? Zorian finally said, unable to restrain himself any longer. Shouldn't you be casting spells to confirm my story? There is no need, Olenik said calmly. I can feel the spiritual sinkhole tugging at my soul easily enough. Zorian looked at Olenik in alarm. We're in no danger, Olenik assured him. The effect is weak and the souls of living beings are tethered to their bodies too strongly to succumb to it. It's only because my awareness of my own soul is so high that I can easily spot it. You have some measure of soul awareness too, I see, but too little to notice such things. So a sufficiently good soul mage could tell that the soul trap existed just by entering its area of effect? No wonder Sudamir considered everyone with a hint of aptitude in the field a threat to his plans. Even if most of the people he killed and kidnapped weren't on the level of skill that Olenek displayed, it only took one to blow his conspiracy wide open. Suddenly, Zorian noticed a group of dark dots flying towards him and swore internally. Damn iron beaks. I hate to interrupt you, but some of the mansion's guards are already coming towards us, Zorian told Olenek. If we don't leave, we'll soon be flooded with winter wolves, undead boars and the like. I speak from experience. Oh, so you've done some sneaking around the place already? Olenek asked curiously. Had you read all the information I brought you, you would have known that, Zorian grumbled. Worry not, we'll get back to the information later, when we start organizing an assault on this place with the army. Zorian gave Olenek a surprised look, startled. What? Olenek laughed. Did you think we were going to infiltrate this place? No, we're bringing soldiers, artillery and several mage combat groups and sieging the place into submission. And you're going to help me investigate the rubble. What, I don't get any say in this? Zorian asked, unable to keep a bit of challenge from creeping into his voice. Damn it, this was exactly what he was afraid of. Don't complain, Olenek told him. I know what you're going to say, you don't want to be involved. You want to go home and pretend this has nothing to do with you, right? Well yeah, Zorian admitted. I gave you all the information I know, what more do you want from me? I truly doubt you've really told me everything you know. And the army will be doubtful as well, Olenek sighed. They will want to find you and they would eventually succeed at doing so. If, on the other hand, you are clearly working for me, they will be leery of going after you. Strange as it may sound to you, you are far safer beside me than you are on your own. As if to punctuate his claim, Olenek pointed his hand at the approaching iron beak flock and snapped his fingers. A dazzling beam of electricity erupted from his palm and struck the leading bird. In the blink of an eye, the beam arced from one bird to another, jumping from target to target. In but a moment, a 20-strong flock had been reduced to a rain of charred corpses and blown-off feathers that descended on the forest canopy. He had to admit that was very impressive. Especially since he knew that Olenek was a fire specialist. It would seem his specialization wasn't as narrow as Zorian had thought. How would the army even know I exist unless you tell them about it? Zorian argued. I'll have to tell them about it, Olenek said, shaking his head. I'm not much of a liar and they can be rather shrewd and persistent. It wouldn't take them long to figure out that I'm working with someone else, and they will naturally want to know who that person is. How annoying. Should he just dismiss this restart as a failure and start over? No, not yet. Maybe he could get this to work. I need to stay anonymous, Zorian eventually said. We will work something out, Olenek said dismissively. And that was that. From that moment onward, Olenek considered him his subordinate. Zorian had to admit, it was kind of amazing how quickly Eldamar could mobilize its forces once it identified a serious threat. It took only 4 days for them to organize the assault on Ayaska Mansion and mobilize the necessary troops. The Triumvirate Church was involved too, sending 2 groups of 12 warrior priests each to support the several hundred soldiers and nearly 50 mages that Eldamar itself threw at the problem. 4 huge war golems and 13 magic-enhanced cannons served as heavy support. Zorian himself was not involved much in the preparations. He mostly just silently followed Olenek around, clad in a face-concealing robe that the warrior priest had given him. The few times he had to speak, he did so exclusively through a magic orb that could translate his thoughts to speech. He had made it himself, surprising Olenek somewhat. Apparently Zorian's standards were a little skewed again, and what he thought was a mildly useful trinket was actually something that was worth quite a bit of money in stores and took some practice to learn how to use. From what Olenek had told him, the rest of the force thought he was some kind of elite investigator in the employ of the Triumvirate Church and were more than a little intimidated by him. Olenek seemed endlessly amused by that. In any case, very few questions had been asked about his presence, but the restart was still young and Zorian didn't dare hope that could last. At least for now, though his identity was secure. He really felt out of his depth in all of this, though. This wasn't what he'd had in mind at all when he had decided to make the church aware of Sudamir's schemes. Hell, Sudamir himself was probably long gone now. There was no way he hadn't noticed all the preparations going on around him. He told Olenek as much one day, but the warrior priest didn't share his opinion. Sudamir has invested a lot of time and money into that place, he said. There's no way he's going to abandon it without a fight. 4 days is not enough for him to evacuate his possessions from that place, and he probably had less than that. I doubt he noticed the preparations straight away. If you had moved more carefully in the start, you could have probably arrested him before he realized what was happening, Zorian said. Not at all. You can't just suddenly arrest a popular and influential mayor like Sudamir like that, Olenek said. You need solid evidence or else people will cry foul. What you gathered is a good start but nowhere near enough. Attacking a mansion full of undead is a lot easier to justify, and I'm sure we will find plenty of evidence to convict him inside. Zorian shook his head, not really convinced, but he didn't argue the point further. He would just have to wait for the assault to see how things went. Olenek and the army might be right after all. Considering the amount of forces the army planned to bring to bear on Ayaska Mansion, there was no way to really launch a surprise attack on the place. Even with the use of teleportation, it would take quite a while to bring everyone over to their destination and assume proper positions. As such, the initial phase of the plan called for 3 groups of mages to arrive first and erect a large-scale teleport ward over the entire region, hopefully preventing Sudamir from simply teleporting out when he realized the sheer scale of the assault heading his way. Well, that part of the plan went off without a hitch. Unfortunately, erecting the anti-teleportation had been like kicking over the hornet's nest. Almost as soon as the wards solidified, endless streams of undead started pouring out of the mansion, as well as from the storage facility next to it. Skeletons, undead boars, flesh golems, massive abominations of stitched human flesh. Zorian didn't even know Sudamir had those. Then again, they were just upscaled versions of a normal flesh golem. The amount of reanimated soldiers Sudamir had at his disposal was mind-boggling. Zorian could only presume that he hadn't faced such hordes in his own incursions on Ayaska Mansion because by that point most of these joined the invaders in their attack on Cyoria. Caught off guard by the ferocious counterattack, the army struggled to organize its forces. Fortunately, these were all disciplined and experienced soldiers, and they came here fully expecting to fight against undead hordes. It would take a lot more than this to demoralize them. Cannons fired again and again into the approaching horde, thinning the ranks considerably. The 4 solid steel war golems, although far inferior in numbers to the giant flesh-stitched monstrosities mixed into the undead ranks, proved to be far superior to them in strength and durability. The giant flesh golems failed to make a breakthrough, being thrown back again and again until they fell apart. Nonetheless, the chaos of that initial exchange meant that a lot of mages and ordinary soldiers fell to the horde. 10 mages and more than 50 normal soldiers became casualties in the first 10 minutes of the battle. After that, however, the army had had enough time to get a grip on the situation. As had the mages. After some initial difficulty, they finished some kind of multi-mage spell and a pair of giant fire vortexes suddenly sprang into existence in front of the approaching horde. Almost like living beings, the 2 vortexes wove through the undead ranks, sucking up reanimated bodies into their center, where they were burnt to a crisp. The strange thing was that instead of growing weaker with time, the vortexes only seemed to be getting stronger with every undead body they consumed. The few reanimated corpses and flesh golems that survived the artillery, war golems, and fire vortexes were met with a hail of grenades and high-caliber bullets wielded by normal soldiers, and none of them survived to make contact with the assault force. And then the top of Ayaska Mansion exploded upwards. For a moment Zorian thought that Sudamir had perhaps once again panicked in the face of a determined attack and did something to screw himself over, just like he had during their last encounter. But then something inside the resulting dust cloud roared. Something huge. The roar reverberated through the area, creating a shockwave of force that blew away all dust and debris shielding the top of Ayaska Mansion from sight. As such, Zorian was treated to a sight of a massive metal platform that was almost entirely taken up by an equally massive skeletal dragon. Its gleaming white bones glowed with countless lines of yellow light that signified a staggering amount of spell formula etched onto the long-dead bones, and instead of being hollow, its ribcage seemed to be crammed full of some kind of metal machinery and likewise looked rather sophisticated in nature. What? Why did Sudamir have that thing? Why hadn't he ever given any indication he had something like that in the past? The skeletal dragon didn't care about Zorian's internal incredulity and muttered curses. Its entire surface lit up with a pale yellow light, creating some sort of ghostly mimicry of a membrane over its wing bones, and then it lazily took flight. It set off straight towards where Zorian and Olenek were standing. The battle for Ayaska Mansion had begun. Chapter 052. Things fall apart. Zorian was caught thoroughly off guard by the appearance of the skeletal dragon. After all, he had already explored Ayaska Mansion during the previous restarts, and thus thought he knew what kind of forces Sudamir had at his disposal. He could hardly believe he'd managed to miss something so big and dramatic. On top of that, the way in which the skeletal dragon revealed itself was very loud and dramatic, and it clearly knew where to find Zorian, since it immediately set off towards him. Well, probably not towards him specifically. In all likelihood, it just went after the assault force leadership trying to perform a decapitation strike. Not a bad idea since most of said leadership was concentrated in one command area. Granted, such an attack needed a proper strike force, one that could somehow bypass the front lines to reach the command area in the back, and one that was strong enough to overcome the defenses protecting it, but the skeletal dragon coming after them probably qualified. He'd fly pretty fast after all, and it was clearly infused with very potent magic. Unfortunately, the leadership of the strike force included Olenek, from whom Zorian never strayed much due to the role he'd assumed in front of the rest of the assault force. So now he had a huge dragon skeleton coming straight at him. Safest place in the entire battlefield, my ass, Zorian mumbled gloomily, just loud enough for Olenek to hear him. The stern priest said nothing, instead focusing on casting a spell of some sort. An anti-scrying measure, if Zorian interpreted his chants and gestures correctly. Zorian supposed that Olenek was disturbed at the ease with which Sudamir had managed to pinpoint their command area, and was trying to prevent further surveillance. Glancing around him, Zorian noticed that the other mages in the command area were also hurriedly casting spells. The command area became a hurricane of activity in a flash, well, even more so than it already had been during the opening clashes of the assault. Despite this, Zorian remained still, aware that any contribution of his would likely cause more harm than good. He could barely understand what was going on around him, so how could he make sure he wasn't getting in the way? Unless one of the mages asked for his assistance, he would refrain from doing anything. The dragon had barely started its flight towards the command area when a thick black cloud rose into the sky from the forest around the mansion. Iron beaks. Their numbers blackened the sky and filled the air with ominous cawing that could easily be heard all the way to where Zorian was standing. Sudamir probably intended them to serve as a distraction for the skeleton dragon. The swarm of magical corvids quickly separated itself into 5 smaller flocks and descended upon the assault force, sending a rain of knife-like feathers at the Eldamarian soldiers. In response, one Eldamarian war golem pointed its metal palms at the approaching iron beaks, and a series of explosions erupted in the midst of the flock, killing hundreds of birds with each detonation. The regular soldiers were not defenseless either and soon brought out some kind of grenade launcher devices and started firing potion canisters into the air. They detonated into flashes of light and electricity, effortlessly scything through the attacking birds. Despite this, the iron beaks kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. If anything, the death of so many of their kin only made them fiercer and angrier, if the increased volume of cawing and feather attacks was any indication. Zorian frowned and shifted in his place uneasily. He had been uneasy with the trajectory of the whole restart for a while now, feeling he had completely lost control over events a while ago. Seeing the scene in front of him, that unease only grew stronger. The Eldamarian forces might even lose at this rate. Should he end the current restart and start over? Oh, no, not yet. He was taking a bit of a risk, since dying here meant getting sucked into that soul-gathering pillar that Sudamir had in his mansion, but he wanted to see how things would develop. At the very least, he wanted to see how the battle would end. Maybe Sudamir had more surprises in store for them, not just the undead dragon currently flying towards him. And speaking of the skeletal dragon, Zorian had expected it to swoop in and try to tear them apart in melee combat. Most skeletons could not manage much beside that. Evidently, though, the spell formula and machinery used in this skeletal dragon's construction were not there just for show. Still on its way towards them, the dragon skeleton opened its maw and fired a thin yellow spell beam at them from within the depths of its skull. The beam was faint and translucent, but Zorian knew better than to assume this made it weak. It crossed the distance between the dragon and the command area in an instant, losing little of its coherence in the process. Thankfully, the mages in charge of the defense had good reflexes. In the brief moment between when the skeletal dragon opened its maw and the beam flew out, they managed to erect a barrier to tank the blow. Unlike the barriers that Zorian was familiar with, this one wasn't a thin layer of force. It was a thick, gelatinous wall of ectoplasm that distorted everything seen through it. The undead dragon's beam impacted the wall and blew a huge crater in its surface, easily digging through more than half of its thickness. However, the nearby material in the rest of the wall quickly flowed into the hole, filling it up in a matter of seconds. Soon the whole thing looked as if it had never been damaged in the first place. The dragon fired the beam 2 more times, trying to overwhelm the defense by targeting the same spot on the wall through continuous fire. It failed. It simply could not deal enough damage to counteract the wall's regenerative abilities. Undaunted by the failure, the skeletal dragon continued flying towards the command area. The 2 fire vortexes that were created to deal with the initial undead horde, still going strong, moved to intercept the creature. The dragon actually swerved from its trajectory to confront one of the vortexes, breathing some kind of massive dispelling wave at it. Although the flame of the vortex grew noticeably dimmer in the wave's passage, it resisted dispersal. At the same time, volley after volley of spell projectiles started homing in towards the undead dragon as it entered the range of defending mages. The spells hurled at it were very diverse. Just about every one of them was different from the rest in some fashion. After a while, Zorian realized that they were testing the dragon's wards to see if there were any obvious weaknesses in its defenses. Unfortunately, the attack spells hurled at the skeletal dragon were about as successful as the dragon's long-range attack on the command area was, which was to say they weren't. Part of the problem was that the skeleton dragon was surprisingly agile, swooping through the air with incredible grace, and a part of it was that it had its own force field to protect itself. It was just a simple force Aegis, nothing fancy, but there was a reason why the Aegis series of spells was so popular among mages. They worked pretty well. A layer of force like that could stop anything that a physical obstacle could, and most spells couldn't go through solid objects. Still, the spell volleys continued to come, and the 2 fire vortexes did their damnedest to engulf the dragon and drag it into their fiery depths. Though the vortexes looked like energy constructs, they could evidently exert plenty of physical force, because they managed to completely halt the dragon's advance. Their attempts to do actual damage nonetheless proved completely ineffectual. The skeletal dragon seemed to possess inexhaustible quantities of mana for the purposes of powering its defenses, and everything that connected with it was shrugged off. It was probably powered by captured souls, much like the mansion it was defending. But the skeletal dragon's advance had been halted, and no defense was truly perfect. One of the mages found a spell that was remarkably good at burning through the thing's shield, some kind of disc made out of purple fire that glued itself to the surface of the shield and kept draining it, and eventually the first layer of the skeleton dragon's defenses fell. Unfortunately, the undead dragon seemed to have realized it had found itself in an unenviable position and promptly intensified its struggles. It fired one attack after another at the fire vortexes, occasionally sending an attack or 2 at the other threats targeting it, causing both vortexes to disperse. And then it fired its yellow beams again, but this time it didn't aim them directly at the command area or the rest of the Eldamarian forces. Instead, it fired the beam at the ground in front of its targets, dragging the beams across the landscape. Huge amounts of dust and gravel were thrown into the air, reducing visibility and disrupting many of the spell volleys coming after it. Many of the spell projectiles fared poorly when aimed through dust clouds, detonating prematurely or veering off course. By now, Zorian was completely certain that he was not dealing with a mindless automaton like most of the undead were. The decisions made by the skeletal dragon clearly indicated there was a sapient mind driving its actions. Either the construct itself was not as mindless as your average skeleton, or Sudamir was personally piloting it through some remote link, much like Zorian had been piloting his golems the last time he'd invaded Ayaska Mansion. If the dragon was not a mindless undead, then that meant it was potentially vulnerable to mind magic. He tried to extend his mind sense far enough to check up on the idea, but the dragon was still too far away for that. "Can you lure it closer?" Zorian asked Dolinik. "I know it's dangerous, but I might be able to disable it if I can get close to it." "We're already working on it," one of the mages close to them said suddenly, cutting into the conversation before Olinik could say anything. "We have a surprise of our own prepared for it once it gets close enough. But we can't be too blatant about luring it here, or it will realize something is wrong and keep its distance." "What do you have in mind?" "I want to try attacking its mind," Zorian admitted. "Oh. A mind mage, huh? The man asked him rhetorically, giving him a speculative look. Could work, I guess. Tell me when you think the moment is right and we'll try to give you an opening. Zorian didn't really understand what kind of opening they thought they could give him when it came to mind magic assault, but he nodded in assent anyway. While most of the mages had been trying to deal with the undead dragon, the rest of Eldamar's forces had been busy dealing with the iron beaks assailing them. At some point, isolated packs of winter wolves and war trolls had joined the iron beaks in their counterattack, but somehow Eldamar's forces were still holding. After a few minutes, Zorian noticed that some of the mages were teleporting away and returning with extra forces and realized how, apparently Eldamar had been prepared for the possibility of the assault going wrong and prepared reinforcements to be brought in as needed. A small but steady stream of new mages and mundane soldiers constantly kept trickling into the area to strengthen the existing forces. It's coming, the mage that had previously spoken with Zorian shouted. And indeed, the undead dragon had clearly decided it was done playing around and made a beeline straight at the command area once more. The man turned to Zorian. We'll hit it with a dozen paralysis bolts the moment it comes close enough. It probably won't do anything, but it should tie up some of its mental defenses. The moment I give you the signal, do your thing. You have one attempt and then we'll go with our plan. Zorian concentrated at the approaching enemy, extending his mind sense as far as he could in the skeletal dragon's direction. The dragon fired beam after beam at the barrier protecting the command area, and the damage done to the wall was noticeably growing more severe as it got closer. At point-blank range, it could probably cut through the wall of ectoplasm and deal actual damage to the command area, provided it still had enough power to punch through the rest of the defensive wards that had been erected around the area when the place had been made. Still, even if the wards could hold out against the beams for a time, they surely would not last long. It was best to stop the thing as quickly as possible. The skeleton dragon accelerated as it got closer, clearly intending to ram the wall with its entire mass, trusting its durability. The moment it had entered Zorian's psychic range, however, he knew he had it. He could sense the mind behind the dragon clear as day. It was shielded, but Zorian could immediately tell it was not enough to stop him from breaking through. He didn't have much time, though. The dragon was traveling pretty damn fast, and 12 bright blue bolts suddenly converged at the approaching skeletal dragon, cast by the mages around Zorian. This close, their target could not dodge, even with its amazing aerial acrobatics, and its force aegis had been exhausted long ago. The moment the bolts had struck the undead dragon, their combined force smashed the mental shield protecting its mind like a hammer striking an egg. For a fraction of a second, the dragon's skeletal form even grew rigid, continuing to fly forward due to existing momentum but temporarily paralyzed by the combined effect of those 12 bolts. But although the paralysis itself had been shrugged off almost instantly, that was immaterial. The important thing was that its mental shield had been stripped away from it, leaving it completely unguarded. Zorian immediately launched a barrage of psychic knives straight at the mind that controlled the dragon. The controller recoiled in pain and shock, caught by surprise by the brutal assault, and Zorian took advantage of its weakened influence on the undead dragon to seize control of it for a moment. In an instant, the skeleton dragon changed the direction of its flight downward, plowing straight into the ground with all of its considerable speed. Mountains of dust and gravel erupted into the air as it dug a deep trench into the ground below, slamming into several trees. The trees came out worse in the collision, before gradually coming to a halt some distance from the command area. For a moment, everyone around Zorian halted and turned towards him in silence. "Holy hell," somebody said. "That actually worked." "It's still intact," Zorian said tersely. "And the controller is still fighting me for influence. All I can do is keep it still for the moment, and even that isn't going to last long." Indeed, while the undead dragon's controller had been caught off guard by Zorian's move, the fact was that trying to attack a controller through the puppet they were controlling was not an easy thing to do, even for him. It greatly lowered the speed and power of Zorian's mental attacks, and the controller had already restored their mental defenses by now and was doing his damnedest to reassert control over the skeletal dragon. The blasted thing clearly had some kind of powerful control array built into it, because Zorian was quickly losing the battle for control over it. "You've done more than enough," Alanik said before turning to one of the army leaders around him. "Fire the living metal rounds." Behind the command area, 4 hidden artillery emplacements opened fire, each one unerringly hitting the immobile skeletal dragon. Instead of exploding, The projectiles erupted into a tangled mess of silvery threads that wrapped themselves around the skeletal dragon, seeking to entangle it firmly. Originally we wanted to use this to force it down to the ground, Olenek told him. But this is even better. Once the living metal roots itself into the ground, that thing will never set flight again. How long do you think? Zorian felt the mind behind the dragon finally wrench control of the body away from him, and the immobile form of the skeletal dragon suddenly began to struggle and thrash against the metal threads. Never mind, Olenek sighed. I guess we'll have to do this the hard way. Though the undead dragon struggled fiercely, the metal threads appeared unbreakable. They writhed and coiled like some kind of metallic worms, constantly seeking purchase on the long-dead bones. Far from freeing itself, the dragon's struggle seemed to only leave it in direr straits, as the threads took advantage of its shifting and thrashing to bind it more firmly. It tried to render the threads inert by breathing a dispelling wave at them, cycled through 4 different magical fields, also doing nothing to the threads, before finally trying to fire its deadly yellow beam at the nearby command area. Unfortunately for it, the threads had restricted its movements too much by that point, and it could no longer point its head in the proper direction. Frustrated, the dragon roared, much like it had when it had first revealed itself. This close, its roar was more than just an intimidation tool. The sound was loud enough to rupture one's eardrums, and the kinetic shockwave created by the roar itself could easily send an unprotected man flying. Fortunately, the command area was warded against such relatively minor damage, and Zorian simply had to endure some painful ringing in his ears in the aftermath. Eldamarian forces started to rain spells and artillery shells at the dragon, apparently unconcerned with the possibility of damaging the living metal threads that were keeping the undead dragon chained to the ground. For good reason, it turned out, as nothing seemed to do any damage to them. Or perhaps any damage dealt to them was immediately healed. The living metal thing they were made of seemed to be a very morphic, malleable material. Sudamir didn't seem to like the predicament his fancy undead superweapon found itself in, because not long after the attack barrage started, several massive magical projectiles were launched into the air from Ayaska Mansion. They ascended high into the sky before descending down to the earth again, traveling across a parabolic trajectory and crossing immense distances in the process, far beyond what normal magic was capable of. Zorian was reminded of that very first invasion, that he could actually remember, and the fake fireworks that served as a beginning of the invasion. It was the same thing. He could instantly tell he was dealing with artillery magic. Spells like those took a long time to cast and used incredible amounts of mana to power them, but they had both extreme range and extreme damage potential. Zorian wasn't the only one who had immediately figured it out. Almost immediately, the leadership of the assault force decided to abandon their current position. 2 of the projectiles were aimed at the command area, and nobody was sure whether the existing defenses would hold out against even one. Fortunately, artillery spells like these ones were very slow, making it easy to move away before they hit. Fundamentally, they were intended to be used against static targets, and were ineffective against things that could move out of the way. But Zorian suspected that Sudamir never intended for them to actually die. He just wanted to disrupt their attack on his pet undead dragon. A ploy that was quite successful, as Eldamarian forces scrambled to get out of the way of the descending artillery spells. But Eldamarian mages didn't just passively run away. Even as they shifted their forces to escape from the blast areas, they began to cast artillery spells of their own as retaliation. Soon, several new artillery spells rose in the air, targeting Ayaska Mansion. Sudamir had still struck first, though, so by the time they were halfway to their target, the artillery spells that had been launched from Ayaska Mansion reached their destination. One of them was, amazingly enough, targeting the skeletal dragon. It seemed Sudamir was gambling on the idea that his dragon was tougher than the living metal threads that kept it restrained. The world erupted into fire, light, and noise. Almost immediately afterwards, the skeletal dragon flew out of the dust cloud created above its former prison. It was missing one of its legs and some of its bones were cracked, the spell formula inscribed on them growing dim, but it still moved. Some of the living metal threads still clung to its bones, stubbornly refusing to let go, but there were too few of them now to do anything more than annoy it. It seemed that Sudamir had gambled correctly. The world exploded again as Eldamarian artillery spells reached their destination as well. A shining golden dome of force intercepted the projectiles, shielding Ayaska Mansion from devastation, but it was left dim and flickering in the aftermath. The undead dragon immediately turned back, retreating towards Ayaska Mansion. Its retreat seemed to signify a general retreat, because the surviving winter wolves and war trolls also fled back into the safety of their base. As for the Iron Beaks, their numbers had been cut down to less than half, and the moment they saw the skeletal dragon fleeing from the assault force, they scattered in every direction, flying away from Ayaska Mansion at maximum speed. Scanning the minds of several frantic Iron Beaks flying above him, Zorian could tell they had no intention of ever returning to this place. Whatever force Sudamir had used to keep them on his side was apparently insufficient to make them ignore the massive losses they had suffered in this battle. The first battle for Ayaska Mansion was finished, but nobody was fooled into thinking the rest of the siege would be easy. Over the course of the next several hours, Sudamir did his best to stall Eldamar's forces as much as possible. His surviving forces launched constant raids on the assault force, doing little damage at this point but successfully breaking the army's forward momentum. The skeletal dragon in particular was still a menace. It no longer made bold frontal attacks like the one it had performed in the beginning, but it made sure to go after any perceived weakness or recklessness. In addition to that, the area immediately around the mansion was full of hastily erected traps, both magical and mundane, as well as ambush parties composed out of those familiar black-clad undead corpses that Zorian had met before in Ayaska Mansion. Finally, the defensive wards on the mansion were running at maximum power, burning through whatever mana reserves they had stockpiled to resist the constant artillery bombardment that was being directed at it ever since Sudamir had launched his artillery spells at the assault force. At first, Zorian felt that this kind of stalling action was a perfectly sensible decision on Sudamir's part. He was probably buying himself enough time to evacuate his Abasan buddies back to their other bases through the dimensional gate in his basement, and would probably escape through it himself at the end. But as hours went by, it became obvious that Sudamir really intended to fight the assault force to the bitter end for some reason. He could have surely escaped ages ago if he really wanted to. Regardless of how determined Sudamir was to defend his mansion to the end, the outcome had already been decided at the end of that first battle. As hours passed, the noose kept tightening around Sudamir's neck. The forest around the mansion was burned down to cinders to prevent further ambushes and traps. Sudamir's stockpile of undead minions eventually started to run out and the mansion's wards were clearly on the verge of breaking. And then Sudamir did something that Zorian would have never expected him to. He surrendered. Even more amazingly, his surrender was not some kind of trap like Zorian suspected it was when he first heard about it. In the end, Sudamir really did open the gates of his mansion and powered down the defensive wards, letting himself be captured. That just didn't make sense to Zorian. He could have escaped easily enough. The Abasans inside the mansion certainly hadn't stayed. Eldamarian forces found plenty of evidence that a lot of people had been living inside the mansion until very recently, but no one other than Sudamir himself was still present. Even if the Abasans had shut the gate on him, Sudamir could have surely just ridden into the sunset on his fancy skeletal dragon. Zorian waited for a while to give the Eldamarian investigators a chance to explore Ayaska Mansion, and then went to confront Alanik about his concerns. "What is there to be confused about?" Alanik asked him. "If Sudamir had persisted in his resistance, we would have collapsed his stronghold on top of him and he would have died. Nobody wants to die, least of all a necromancer. But the gate we found in his basement," Zorian began. "Yes, shocking stuff," Alanik frowned. "It does seem strange that he did not retreat through the gate along with his unknown allies, doesn't it? But you have to remember, just because they cooperated doesn't mean they were actually friendly to one another. It could be that he expects better treatment as an Eldamarian captive than as a long-term guest of his so-called allies. Even so, it shouldn't have been too hard to flee from the battle if he was determined," Zorian insisted. "He could have flown out, for instance. Gods know we couldn't have really stopped that pet undead dragon of his if it had simply flown off in a random direction." "No, but we could have tracked it," Alanik said. "But yes, you are probably right. He could have fled. But that would have meant that we would have leveled this place to the ground. Sudamir seems to be very attached to this place. It seems this is his life's work and he is loath to see it gone. He cares about his soul trap thing so much. Isn't it destined for destruction anyway?" Zorian asked, frowning. "Surely Eldamar is not going to let a giant soul trap remain intact?" Alanik stared at him for a few seconds before sighing heavily. "They're definitely going to release the souls trapped within. Too many people know about them by now, and it would be a huge scandal if it became known they let so many innocent souls remain trapped in that thing. At the very least, I'm sure I can get the Triumvirate Church to apply pressure on Eldamar to do so. Unfortunately, I cannot guarantee that the device itself will be destroyed. Sudamir's work is utterly repugnant, but also very impressive to some people. It's entirely possible he can reach some kind of agreement with Eldamar's government. Agreement? Zorian asked incredulously. How could that possibly work? I know that Eldamar has some secret necromancers under their employ, but Sudamir is... I know, Alanik said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. But it would be completely in line with Eldamar's previous behavior to retool this place into a secret research facility and then place Sudamir under house arrest here. He would be forced to work for Eldamar and all manner of restrictions would be imposed on him, some of them ethical in nature, but that is obviously a far lighter punishment than a monster like him deserves. I'm almost 100% certain that this is what Sudamir is aiming for. I see, said Zorian unhappily. He knew that Eldamar was no image of perfection and goodness, but he was still unpleasantly surprised that they would be willing to work with someone like Sudamir. Then again, they still didn't know that Sudamir wasn't just practicing illegal magic, but was also actively betraying the country to foreign enemies. Zorian suspected that Eldamar would be a lot less willing to make use of Sudamir once that little fact came out. Of course, Alanik continued, if I were to find out something particularly damning about the man before Eldamar's black divisions have a chance to sequester him to one of their compounds for questioning, then such an agreement might become politically unworkable. There is only so much that can be swept under the rug after all. Zorian gave Alanik a suspicious look. Meaning, what exactly? Zorian asked. Your ability to target Sudamir's mind through his bone dragon puppet was very impressive, Alanik noted. So it was Sudamir who had been piloting that thing. Zorian had wondered about that. Even if it was for but a moment, you must be a pretty good mind mage to have achieved that. Wait, Alanik was offering him a chance to root through Sudamir's mind for information? Why yes, Zorian was very much interested. Say no more, Zorian told Alanik, trying not to show his enthusiasm. I'll be happy to help you interrogate him. Come with me then, Alanik said, turning around and motioning for Zorian to follow after him. Mind you, we'll only have an hour or so alone with him. This isn't exactly an official interrogation and there is only so much I can bend the rules. Zorian didn't really care. Frankly, he had a strong feeling he was going to have to terminate this restart prematurely sometime soon anyway, so getting into trouble like that was no big deal. He was just happy this opportunity had fallen so neatly into his lap. He thought he would actually have to try and scheme to get access to Sudamir. He followed after Alanik, mentally preparing a list of questions he wanted Sudamir to answer. How come you didn't just pump him full of truth potions and interrogate him that way? Zorian asked. He knew that Alanik had done that sort of thing in previous restarts, so it was a bit strange to see him hold back in that regard now. That leaves too many traces in the victim's metabolism, Alanik said, shaking his head. I did say I'm bending the rules here, didn't I? I need to be able to play dumb when Sudamir accuses me of using magic to force answers out of him. Right, Zorian nodded. Sorry for being dumb, but I have no experience in things like these, so you'll have to be a little patient with me. An expert mind mage that has no experience in things like these, Alanik stated blandly, visibly rolling his eyes. Right. Zorian decided not to respond to that. There was no way he could explain how he had really gotten his mind-reading skills, so it was best to stay silent and quietly appreciate the way Alanik was not questioning him about that. For now anyway. Sudamir looked surprisingly good for someone who had gotten captured by an Eldamarian assault force. He was wearing shaping disrupting manacles on his wrists and an exploding collar around his neck, but other than that he appeared completely unharmed. He seemed jittery and impatient when they came in, giving Alanik a sour look but not saying anything. Reading his surface thoughts, Zorian found out that Alanik had already been here a couple of times to ask the man questions, and Sudamir was already sick of him. The man refused to discuss anything with Alanik, apparently aware that there was something fishy about him being sent in as an official Eldamarian interrogator. Zorian shrugged and got to work. He didn't try to be subtle. He immediately performed a powerful mental attack on Sudamir, ruthlessly crushing his mental defenses and sending feelers deep into his mind. Sudamir clutched his head in pain, powerless to resist. This close to Zorian, and with his ability to cast spells suppressed by the manacles he was wearing, Sudamir had little hope to expel Zorian from his mind. He couldn't even scream or shout for help, since Zorian had prevented him from doing that. The only difficult thing was making Sudamir speak his answers out loud for Alanik's benefit. He didn't want the warrior priest to know just how effortlessly he could root through someone's memories, but forcing the man to do something was far harder than simply interpreting Sudamir's thoughts and memories. And also, Sudamir was under compulsion not to speak about certain topics. It turned out he had gotten clever and placed a haze on himself before surrendering, placing restrictions on his ability to discuss some things. Stuff like his cooperation with the Abasins and the planned invasion of Cyoria. This was, of course, completely unacceptable. A big part of reporting Ayaska Mansion to Alanik was Zorian's desire to blow the whole conspiracy thing wide open, so the haze definitely had to go. Zorian was not really a soul mage, so simply removing the haze was out of the question. Fortunately, he didn't have to do that to neutralize it. Mind magic was a known bane of the haze-type spells. A haze couldn't prevent a mind mage like Zorian from lifting information straight from someone's mind, and it could not compel one to follow an order they could not remember ever receiving. One of the reasons why haze were not more popular throughout history was that if the recipient of the haze was unwilling to play along, they could simply pay a mind mage to purge their memories of the restriction they labored under. The haze would still technically exist, but the compulsion to honor it would be gone. The haze Sudamir had placed on himself was very fresh, less than a day old, and thus it took less than 5 minutes for Zorian to make Sudamir forget it ever existed. He didn't even bother notifying Alanik of its existence. In any case, once the full scale of Sudamir's activities started to come to the surface, Alanik decided that he no longer cared about keeping the interrogation short and covert. The interrogation lasted for hours, and only ended because Zorian was afraid he might permanently cripple Sudamir's mind if he kept rummaging through it incessantly. During those several hours, Zorian found out a wealth of information about the Abasin invaders, cult of the World Dragon, and Sudamir. Most of this information involved the identities of collaborators and places where evidence could be found to doom them all. This was the sort of information that Alanik was most interested in, and Zorian saw no reason not to give it to him. In fact, he intended to visit some of these people himself in some future restarts, but for now he would simply step aside and let Alanik go after them. For Zorian, though, some of the more interesting pieces of information he got from Sudamir concerned the man's reasons for doing what he did. The core of everything seemed to be the fact that his wife died. To be fair, Sudamir was an unscrupulous necromancer even before then, but it was only after his wife contracted the weeping and passed away that he'd really lost it. Rather than accept her death and move on, he extracted her soul and tried to bring her back to life. He failed naturally. Apparently it was not a simple thing to make a dead soul think again, to say nothing of actually restoring it to a semblance of life. Eventually he bound his wife's soul to Ayaska Mansion, restoring a measure of her mental faculties in the process. That was why the warding scheme of the place could intelligently respond to scans and attempts to bypass it, and also the reason why Sudamir had been utterly unwilling to see it destroyed. He would rather let himself be captured than abandon his wife's soul to eventual destruction. In fact, the biggest reason why Sudamir agreed to help the Abasins was that Quatakikal promised to give him the ritual needed to turn his wife's soul into a lich. A normal lich creation ritual required a living person to work correctly, but Quatakikal claimed he could modify it to work on the disembodied soul of Sudamir's wife too. Whether Quatakikal was lying about that was anyone's guess. The other reason for helping the Abasins invade Cyoria, the politics part that Sudamir had mentioned in the past, was that Sudamir wanted to legalize necromancy. After all, his wife was soon to come back to life as a lich, and he certainly didn't plan to die of old age if he could help it either, and it was impossible for him to hide things like that in the long term. Especially if he intended to keep his political position, which he definitely did. Thus, he wanted to make Eldamar drop some of the restrictions surrounding soul magic, or at least to make some special exceptions for him in particular. To that end, he felt he needed to make Eldamar weaker, so they would be desperate for his help, and himself stronger, so he could be the savior they were in desperate need of. The actual details of Sudamir's master plan eluded Zorian, as they were too complex and convoluted for him to figure out in a mere couple of hours. And frankly, Zorian didn't care that much. He found the whole thing crazy to start with and felt that it was all just an excuse anyway. Sudamir helped the Abasins because he wanted his wife back. Everything else was just him lying to himself. Zorian also encountered a couple of other interesting facts while searching Sudamir's mind, such as the means Sudamir had used to control the Iron Beaks. Apparently it was a mixture of kidnapping their chicks to hold as hostages and dominating some of the more influential members of the flock. Iron Beaks were fiercely protective of their young and intelligent enough to understand a hostage situation, and also didn't seem to realize their leadership structure had been magically subverted, so this ploy worked surprisingly well. Zorian still wasn't sure if it was possible to do anything with this information, but he filed it away for future musings. Eventually the topic of the interrogation drifted to the issue of primordial summoning, well, more like Zorian guided it there, but whatever, and Zorian decided to see if Sudamir knew the answer to a question that had been bothering Zorian for quite some time. Why does the cult of the World Dragon need a shifter child to complete the ritual? Zorian asked. Children. Plural, Sudamir said. He had mostly stopped struggling against Zorian's mental probes by now, since it hurt a lot less that way. Currently he mostly focused on trying to shift the interrogation away from sensitive topics. Too bad for him that Zorian knew a great deal about what he and his allies had been doing in the past several months. The ritual needs at least 5 shifter children to work. Ideally more. Zorian frowned. 5 children? What happens to them? Olenek asked. Sacrificed, of course, Sudamir said, rolling his eyes. His thoughts told Zorian that he considered that a very stupid question. Ask an obvious question, get an obvious answer. Why so many? Zorian asked. And why children? Why shifter children? There is only so much primordial essence one can extract from any particular shifter, Sudamir said. And that essence gets progressively more integrated into the shifter's body as they age, making it next to impossible to extract. Only very young shifters have any significant amount of free-floating primordial essence in their bodies. What? Explain, Olenek told him. Sudamir sighed. Simply splicing a foreign soul into your own won't make you a shifter. At least not the kind people are familiar with. A stream of disjointed flashes flew across Sudamir's mind and Zorian dived deeper into his memories to investigate. Sudamir knew this stuff because he had been doing research into shifters for years now. He had captured dozens of shifters, experimenting on them in a brutal fashion to see what makes them tick. He even made several attempts to produce one, the most successful one being his production of the Silver One. Disturbingly though, the Silver One wasn't a human granted the ability to turn into a winter wolf, but the opposite. He had grafted a human soul onto a winter wolf, granting him increased intelligence and ability to turn human if he so wished. Why would he do such a thing? Zorian took a deep breath and pushed the thought out of his mind. While horrible, Sudamir's shifter experiments were basically a drop in the bucket as far as Sudamir's crimes were concerned. Asking him about it would just waste the little time he had left with the man. In order to make the transformation so flexible and thorough, the ancestors of modern shifters had to use something more, Sudamir continued. Specifically, they used a bit of primordial blood they had recovered from the creature imprisoned beneath Cyoria. That particular primordial was noted for its shape-shifting prowess, and thus served as a potent catalyst for their own rituals. It is one of the reasons why their shifter rituals are so hard to acquire for outsiders. Even if they can procure the instructions for the ritual, they still need the blood of an existing shifter to perform it, because they're the only ones with primordial essence coursing through their blood. The cultists want to use that primordial essence as a key to open the prison, Zorian mused out loud. Yes, Sudamir confirmed. Zorian could feel that the man liked talking about this topic, as it shifted the interrogation away from his misdeeds onto someone he didn't much care about. Although he was technically a member of the cult, Sudamir didn't seem to have any emotional attachment to his fellow initiates. In a way, that essence is still a part of the primordial, and can thus be used as a tool for bridging the gap between our world and the pocket dimension where the primordial has been imprisoned. Pocket dimension, huh? Olenek said. That is why they call it a summoning ritual, Sudamir said. Technically, the primordial isn't on the same plane of existence as the rest of us. The gods made a special extra-dimensional prison to shove it into. Such pocket dimensions always have a place where they touch our reality, though, and the cult has long ago found where the anchor point for the prison is. Zorian was forced to terminate the interrogation soon afterwards, but before he did so, he made sure to memory wipe Sudamir of his recent memories. As far as he was concerned, the interrogation had never taken place. As they left, Alanik commented on the fact Zorian was not using any words or gestures to perform his mind magic. His tolerance for Zorian's peculiarities was probably steadily approaching the breaking point, and he would soon demand some kind of explanation. Unfortunate, but the lack of gestures and chants was not something Zorian could fake. He was pretty sure an expert mage like Alanik would notice if he tried to make something up to mask his ability. By the time he'd finally gone back to Cyoria, it was already evening and Kiriel was sound asleep. Imaya remained awake to wait for him, which Zorian found a little bizarre. He had already made up an excuse yesterday for the fact that he would be absent for an entire day, and told her not to wait for him. She cared a bit too much about her tenants for a landlord in his opinion. As he went to bed, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of chaos was going to follow in the wake of the fall of Ayaska Mansion. He supposed he would find out soon. Break. In the next couple of days, Alanik left him alone and refrained from getting him involved in further investigations. That didn't mean that he and the rest of Eldamar's authorities were idle. Though, in the days that followed, Cyoria was rocked by one scandal after another as important people started getting arrested and brought in for questioning left and right. Zorian paid close attention to who was getting arrested, even though he actually already knew most of them due to his interrogation session with Sudamir. Aside from paying attention to the arrests going around him and the reactions they were causing, Zorian also executed several attacks against various Iranian webs to continue accumulating experience needed for interpreting the matriarch's memory packet. He was good enough at picking his targets at this point that he had few issues with actually subduing Iranian patrols, but he found the experience very draining in an emotional sense. He was basically attacking random Irania for no reason whatsoever, all because he needed a victim to practice his memory reading on, and it was hard not to feel like a villain. Some of the Irania begged him to stop or repeatedly tried to talk to him instead of fighting back. He simply withdrew whenever he encountered such individuals, seeking out more aggressive individuals that actually fought back against his unprovoked aggression, even though that was infinitely more dangerous and definitely not the most efficient strategy. A few days more passed before Alanik had finally contacted him, using a letter of all things. The message was short, basically telling him that some people were asking about him, but that he was successfully dodging their questions for now. The letter warned Zorian not to draw further attention if he wished to remain anonymous, since people were already interested in him. Fair enough. He had already decided he would terminate the restart in a few more days. He just wanted to wait for a little while longer to see if something interesting would happen, since he didn't think the arrest had reached a critical point yet. By this point Kale had moved into the house and Zorian had already told him about the time loop and given him his research notebooks, so he decided to tell him a little about Sudamir and the information he had learned from the man. He omitted any information about Kale's friends and acquaintances, since the Morlock had told him to keep that secret from him, but that still left a lot of stuff to talk about. Oh. Shifters have the essence of a primordial inside of their bodies, Kale said surprised. That's what the man said at least. Zorian nodded. I can't help but wonder how this extraction thing works. Do the cultists really have to kill those kids to get this primordial essence? Almost certainly, Kale nodded. It sounds like it's part of their life force. It would make sense for something that is inherited from parent to child. Regardless of method, removing someone's life force is never benign. Ritual sacrifice is simply the fastest way to perform blood magic on them, but even if the cultists use something fancier, the results would likely be the same. Blood magic? Asked Zorian curiously. You know what that is? Ah, right, you probably don't know. The Mage Guild does tend to suppress that information, doesn't it? Kale mused. Blood magic involves using people's life force, usually to fuel various spells. Life force is really potent, much more so than regular mana, so the temptation is always there. Of course, not only are blood magic rituals incredibly dangerous, using your life force also has terrible effects on the body. Thus, most mages who dabble in it prefer to use other people's life force instead of their own. You know all those stories about villains that ritually sacrifice people for power? They're basically doing blood magic. Oh. So that's blood magic? Kind of underwhelming, Zorian said. I thought it would be something incredibly arcane and sinister, considering how obsessive the Mage Guild is about purging any mention of it from books. Blood magic is very easy to do so long as you have a steady stream of sacrifices, Kale said. And there is little variation in the amount of life force between different humans. Any random civilian will do as a sacrifice. It's a very quick if bloody road to power, and the Mage Guild is afraid that if the information about blood magic was freely available, you would see blood mages popping up all over the place. I've also heard that blood magic can be used to steal other people's bloodlines and special abilities, and you can imagine how all those super special noble houses would feel about that. The Mage Guild cracks down on it very viciously, and blood magic produces too many victims for a practitioner to hide for long. Before Zorian could continue the conversation, a series of explosions started to erupt across the city, causing them both to run outside to see what was happening. They found the rest of the inhabitants of the house to be unhurt but confused and frightened by the detonations, though Zorian already had a pretty good idea what was happening. His suspicions were confirmed when he climbed to the roof of the house and took a look at the city around them, only to see vast swathes of it burning and many of the streets overrun with war trolls and hostile mages. The Abasins and the cult of the World Dragon had decided to launch their invasion early. The next several hours were a blur. Though the invaders didn't have the support of Iron Beaks and the undead normally provided by Sudamir, and though Cyoria's forces were far more prepared for foul play this time around, the invaders still had a lot of firepower and did their best to cause huge amounts of damage. Though he wanted to go out and explore this unusual invasion, Zorian couldn't bring himself to abandon the rest of the household alone and undefended to the invaders. Instead he stayed at home, eliminating small groups of invaders that had decided to target this area of the city and occasionally using divination to spy on other parts of the city when things were relatively quiet. Interestingly, despite him eradicating at least 6 battle groups, Quatakikl never showed up to deal with him. Presumably he was a lot busier this time around and couldn't afford to deal with a minor issue like him. To be honest, he didn't understand what the Abasins were trying to accomplish by launching this premature attack. At least their original plan to attack during the summer festival had a chance to really do some lasting harm to the city, while this one was doomed to fail right from the start. Then again, maybe they didn't have much choice. They surely knew by now that Eldamar's investigators were onto them, so waiting for the summer festival was clearly stupid. But with Ayaska Mansion shut down, perhaps retreating to Ulquin Abasa in a timely manner was impossible. After a while, his scrying attempts noticed that fighting was especially fierce around the hole. This was where most of the invading forces were concentrated, and Quatakikl never seemed to move far from the place. Were the invaders gambling everything on the successful summoning of the primordial? Certainly seemed so. A part of him wondered if that meant Notchka had been kidnapped and was being ritually sacrificed as he watched, but he pushed that thought aside. He couldn't do anything about it even if she was, and she would be alive when the next restart begins. It was interesting though. If the cultists successfully released the primordial from its extra-dimensional prison, he would finally be able to see for himself how dangerous and destructive it was. The restart wasn't even close to ending after all, so the primordial would have plenty of time to show its might. Hours ticked by and Zorian suddenly realized this was it. The fighting around the hole had reached a fevered pitch, with Eldamar's soldiers frantically trying to surge forward and overrun the invaders while Quatakikl rained a dizzying variety of suppressive fire on the forces arrayed against him. At some point one of Cyoria's mages actually managed to melt half of his skull off with some kind of golden fire, which was the first time Zorian had ever seen something do actual damage to the ancient lich, but that didn't seem to hold him back much. Above the hole and presumably on the inside of it, space shuddered and writhed, distorting everything like hot summer air. Slowly, jagged black threads started rising into the air from the depths, zigzagging through the air and occasionally forking offshoots. They were cracks, Zorian realized. Reality was breaking. Suddenly, a huge volume of space in the center of the cracks simply caved in, creating a pitch-black hole that hung in the air. Something huge and dark brown, like a hand studded with mouths and eyes, shot out of the rip in space, but Zorian didn't have time to study it much. Without any prompting from him, the marker on his soul suddenly activated and everything went black. He woke up in his bed in Siren with Kiriel wishing him a good morning. With a sigh, Zorian helped Kiriel unload her luggage from the train, his mind still on the events of the previous restart. Why did the time loop restart when it did? Was it because Zack just happened to die at that point, or was it, like Zorian suspected, because the primordial was successfully released into the world? What kind of relationship did the primordial have with the time loop? Was the whole point of the time loop to prevent its release? He wondered whether the time loop ended when it usually did because a month was how long a default restart lasted, or because that's when the primordial was usually released, and he never bothered to stop the ritual until now. "Welcome to Cyoria, Kiri," he told her. "Pretty impressive, isn't it?" He was cheating, of course. He knew that Kiriel found Cyoria's central train station impressive. This time, though, something else seemed to have attracted her attention. She said, pointing behind him. "I think that guy wants to talk to you." Sorian turned around, only to see a pissed-off-looking Zack stomping towards him. Sorian was so shocked at the sight that he didn't move at all until the boy was practically in his face. He opened his mouth to give him an awkward hello, but before he could say anything, Zack's fist shot forward in a blur and punched him in the face.